Hello, this is Aaron Wren. Welcome back to the podcast. My guest today is Matthew Continetti. He's a very special guest because he is the Director of Domestic Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute and also the Patrick and Charlene Neal Chair in American Prosperity there. He's a longtime fixture in American conservative circles. And he's also the article of a book. It actually came out 2 years ago. But I just belatedly got around to reading it, and it was a great book. So I wanted to get him on the show to talk about it. That book is called The Right, The 100-Year War for American Conservatism, which I'm holding up a copy to the screen so you can see what it looks like. So Matt, thank you for joining me, and thanks for writing the book.
Oh, thank you, Aaron. It's great to be here, and I'm always happy to talk about conservatism and the right.
Yeah, I mean, I put together a few pages of questions, and it could have been an infinite number of pages because like every chapter of the book has a lot of stuff that could be like a symposium on what was going on here because there's so much in it. And I've read a number of conservatives' histories before, but I learned a lot of new things in this. There's a wealth of detail in it. Just one example, I learned kind of how George Will got into the conservatism business and the columns business. And we even quote like one of his columns from 1982. And that made me think you had to have done a massive amount of research for this. I mean, I hope you didn't have to read like every George Will column and every Patrick Buchanan column. It would seem overwhelming. How did you approach the research for the book?
Well, I think the way to answer that is to say that in many ways, this book was something of a passion project. I became interested in the history of conservatism really around the time of the 2012 election. I wanted to try to get at what was driving this wedge between the conservatives I knew, who were in the Beltway, like I was, and the conservative grassroots around the country, who clearly were very unhappy with the way that Republican politicians and conservative intellectuals were dealing with the challenges of the moment.
Were you talking about mostly the Tea Party here?
Yeah, it was the Tea Party era. It was the Romney election, which went very badly for Romney and very quickly went badly for him. And I recognize that I did have some resources. Coming into conservative journalism, as I did in 2003 as a graduate from college, I found that the best way to kind of learn my trade was to read the back issues of magazines. I was a journalist. I was working at the Weekly Standard magazine at the time. And so I would just go through the back issues of the Weekly Standard to kind of see how the writers I admired wrote their pieces. How did they settle on topics? How did they structure an article? Who were they referencing in their pieces? And so by the time I became interested in the history of the right, in 2012, I had already read through the Weekly Standard. I had read many back issues of National Review. I had read columns collections of columns by authors like George Will. So I kind of had a backing. And then when I began my research, consciously after 2012, I then kind of used that backing as a base and then read more. So I have read a lot in this subject. I won't say I've read every single George Will column, but I have read all of his books. And I won't say I've read every single Pat Buchanan column, but I have read all of his books. And so
wow,
when you begin building up that kind of library, mental and physical, my wife is always complaining about how many books there are in our house. You can then turn and write a narrative. And that was kind of my goal in writing this book. Because you mentioned George Nash, who is someone I greatly admire. Readers of his conservative intellectual movement in America since 1972 quickly find that the narrative is somewhat disjointed. It's not exactly a chronological narrative. So in my book, I wanted to have a definite starting point and a finishing point. In the hardcover, which you just showed, the starting point is Warren Harding's inauguration in 1921, and the end point is Biden's inauguration in 2021. And then in this paperback edition, we released in 2023, the end point is the aftermath of the 2022 midterms. So it covers a lot of ground, and I found that the way to best discuss the book is topically rather than chronologically, because 100 years is a long time.
Yeah, I mean, you really do. You do tell a chronological story, which is different than Nash, who was sort of thematic, in a sense, overlapping chronologies of different themes. You mentioned Nash because his the conservative intellectual movement in America since 1945. I think you said in the 72. I think it was published in 72.
Oh yes, I'm sorry. Yes,
yeah, it published in 72 originally. That's sort of been kind of the main well-known history of conservatism. And I notice immediately when I compare his book to The Right, the 100-Year War over American Conservatism, two very distinct framings come out. One is he talks about conservatism. And while you mention conservatism in your subtitle, your emphasis is the right. And then again, secondly, he starts in 1945 and you start in 1921. So I'd love to know how you chose those two framings, the right versus conservatism and 1921 versus 1945.
Sure. Well, I think one of the themes of my book is that conservatism is not a monolith, and no national conservatism is a monolith, and American conservatism is especially various in its forms. And so I was looking for a term that would encompass all of that difference, rather than saying this is a history of conservatism or conservatism in America. I wanted to include groups that might not fall into kind of the mainstream definition, always changing, of what the American conservative movement is. And I also wanted to talk about partisan politics, which is something that George Nash really does not do in that classic work you mentioned. So my book is a way of telling a story of the last 100 years that emphasizes the relationship between ideas and public policy and political action. And so in telling that story, I found it would just be categorically easier to call it the right rather than conservatism, because then I would have to spend all my time distinguishing, oh, well, this person isn't quite a conservative, or, this person is outside conservatism, or he's just a Republican politician. I wanted a more kind of capacious term to describe my project.
And how about starting with Warren Harding?
Sure.
Inauguration.
Yeah. Well, that, again, that gets into the chronology. So what I found was the story that the conservative movement told itself really did begin after 1945. It really did begin with kind of the onset of the Cold War, leading to the emergence of anti-communism and the various intellectual revivals of conservatism, and then kind of institutional development devoted to promoting the free market and combating communism. And I found that starting in 1945 didn't quite tell the whole story. If you kind of wound back the clock to 1920, what you found was that, well, conservatism didn't really begin after 1945. There was a right prior to 1945. It's just that it didn't quite see itself as a right. It saw itself as basically American and just defending America, against the real revolution, the real change. And that was Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal in 1932. So by starting in 1920, I was kind of able to see all of the players and the set pieces as they stood before the Great Depression, before Franklin Roosevelt really transformed the federal government and also the citizens' relation to the government. And then I could trace how conservatives came to view themselves as conservatives, and also how they came back from kind of the political margins that FDR had consigned them to during the 1930s. So I found that way, when you told a longer story, you got a fuller picture. And what you also found, or what I also found, was that when you begin the story in 1920, you see that rather than being just the status quo, the kind of Cold War conservatism and post-Cold War conservatism that I knew, that I grew up in, may have actually been something of an aberration. And in fact, the right as we see today in the era of Trump resembles in many ways the right that existed in the 1920s and before the New Deal. And so teasing out the parallels between these two historical eras was another, I think, fruitful effect of beginning the tale in 1921.
Yeah, so you basically see what the right is something that emerged as a coherent phenomenon in opposition to the New Deal? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yes. So for me, the real break came with FDR's election in 32. And what FDR did was dramatically increase the size and scope of the federal government. He changed the relationship between the federal government and the states. And he basically created the entitlement society. He basically made it the federal government's job to make sure that Americans' lives were taken care of. And that had not been the case. And so on domestic policy alone, that meant that there was going to be a more active federal government in the economy. And it created many different sites of resistance against FDR's economic plans.
Mm-hmm.
The problem was Republicans had been so discredited by the New Deal that none of these voices really caught on until after Roosevelt left the picture in 1944 and after the war was ended in 1945. Again, on the foreign policy dimension, well, FDR was very Machiavellian in his foreign policy. It was clear by the 1940 that he felt that Hitler would pose a major threat to the United States, and therefore the United States had to rearm and also support the United Kingdom. And opponents of FDR on domestic politics often were also opponents of FDR on foreign affairs. And so that's where the America First movement comes into being. And that's where you see the kind of non-interventionist opposition to FDR. The change, the real major change in American conservatism, it seems to me, came after the end of World War II, when many people who had been non-interventionists in 1941, prior to Pearl Harbor, decided that America needed to have a much more engaged approach to the world in light of the threat from the Soviet Union and communism.
Yeah, I struggle. One of the things that really struck me when I read Nash's book is that these kind of nascent conservatives around National Review, this sort of post-war movement, kind of had to invent a backstory. They had to construct a history going back to Burke and the founding, when there wasn't necessarily a through line there of people in the way that there was with, say, Marxism or even Straussianism, where today's Straussians are the pupil of someone who studied with a pupil of someone who studied with Strauss. I mean, there's like, there wasn't like this line of sort of master and disciple there. And I kind of struggled to find like, what is kind of conservatism? And it's sort of, if we were going to say, what are the elements of a genuine American conservatism? I think about Walter Russell Mead's division of America into like four themes of the sort of Hamiltonian, Jeffersonian, Jacksonian, and Hamiltonian traditions. And I think really the Wilsonian tradition, like all except the Wilsonian, you could say those are all conservative in a sense. You think of Henry Cabot Lodge being like the heir of the Hamiltonian tradition. And I guess where do you see, like, there obviously are authentic antecedents of what is the right in kind of American kind of cultural and political thought. Where do you kind of see this emerging from in kind of the 19th century?
Sure. Well, you need a left before you can have a right. So conservatives don't really come into being until they face a challenge from the left, from groups or individuals who want to upset the inherited order, the heritage. And political conservatism, as we understand it, really emerges out of the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century. And there, Edmund Burke, the Whig parliamentarian and philosopher, looked at what was happening in France, and he said, here are the reasons that the revolutionists are wrong. And so a conservative intellectual, in the words of Roger Scruton, who was a conservative philosopher himself, is someone who gives reasons for what's taken for granted. And so what we found with Burke's response to the French Revolution was someone who was defending the institutions of government, long-standing institutions that had survived through the process of prescription, what otherwise was taken for granted. Institutions, in Burke's case, like the monarchy, like the Church of England. Now, Burke, interestingly, was a defender of the American colonists when they began to protest the actions of the Parliament and King, eventually leading to the American Revolution. So what does it mean to be an American conservative when you're discussing a country that was born in a revolution? Well, I think each conservatism around the world is unique because each is defending particular institutions. So there's a lot of discussion about Indian conservatism, Indian nationalism today, and its relationship to the United States. Well, obviously, an Indian conservatism is going to be different than an American conservatism, even if they might have a shared sense of pride in their country, a shared sense of the importance of religion, a shared sense of the importance of the traditional. It's going to be different because the institutions are different. In America's case, the institutions that I believe American conservatives ought to defend are our political institutions, our extremely unique political institutions, beginning with the Declaration of Independence, including the Constitution and the system of government and really kind of political economy that those institutions set up. And so for me as an American conservative, I'm looking at individuals who are defending the founding, defending the ideas and the prescriptions of the American founding. And when you say examine the rhetoric of Calvin Coolidge, right, Republican president in the 1920s, you can see that he saw himself as basically the upholder of those ideas and of those institutions. I talk a little bit in the book about his address at the 150th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And I really think that if you read it today, it sounds a lot like what most American conservatives say about their country, about the importance of our form of government, about the liberty that it endows us with. And so that's kind of what I would say it means to be an American conservative, knowing that each type of situation, each set of institutions might produce a different type of conservative.
Nash divides conservatism into the famous three-legged stool of anti-communism, traditionalism, and sort of libertarian economics. You portray conservatism as messier than that. I think it's fair to say. How do you think about the constituents that make up the right in America? What's your schema for thinking about it? Or if there is one.
It's always good to have topologies, or typologies rather. I think they're kind of like the business of intellectuals is to come up with typologies. You're not a good intellectual unless you have, the four schools of American foreign policy, or
right,
three-legged stools, or I guess I kind of see conservatives in America arguing over issues, and in the type of story I'm telling, which is a story that has to deal with politics as much as it has to deal with ideas, the main fissures are over foreign policy, when to intervene, over kind of economic policy, forms of economic policy, how far the market should go, whether tariffs are acceptable, things like that. And then a broader division, and that's the division basically between elites and the populace. So one of the themes of the book is this ongoing conversation, argument between populists and elitists, kind of institutionalists and people who believe that institutions need to be opened up, that people who are in power have the wrong sense of things and the wrong solutions. And so really, I rather than having 4 schools or 3 legs of a stool, I really have 2 camps, populists and elitists. And I kind of trace that through the history of the American right, in particular, the history since the end of the Cold War, rather the end of World War II, when you began to have a coherent conservative movement, which is not something you saw previous to 1945.
You mentioned the criticality of FDR and the New Deal for shaping sort of conservative consciousness, definitely even coming out of World War II. Sort of hostility to the New Deal remained strong for a long time. When I look back at FDR, he's in the pantheon of villains, kind of in conservatism. And when I look back at him, I see a guy that did some bad things and did some things I disagree with. But ultimately, he, in a large scale industrial economy, technological economy, we were going to have a greatly expanded government. We were probably going to have some kind of a safety net. He did do a lot of things like rural electrification, like the Manhattan Project, rearming the country, defeating Nazism. Were the conservatives wrong to have essentially rejected FDR? Wasn't FDR like at least a more ambiguous figure that they did? I would even say the same about an Eisenhower, who seemed like he wasn't such a bad president.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and you're right to link them too, because many of the post-war American conservatives were very critical of Eisenhower as well. In my view, FDR is a very complex figure. I do think he got some big things wrong. Mm-hmm. I do think his pragmatism often led him to adopt a view that the federal government should take care of everything. And that is not the view of the founding. And I do think that FDR, his vision of what the federal government should look like is a vision that I think would diminish human freedom and also human possibility through its squelching and limitation of economic activity. So I don't think they were wrong about FDR. They were wrong about FDR's foreign policy. Mm-hmm. But even FDR was wrong about his own foreign policy, because if you read the history of the 1930s and 1940s, FDR didn't really know what to do here. And he was a little too slow as well to recognize the challenges from Nazi Germany. And we were hit in a surprise attack in 1941. I would say this. We often think, Herbert Hoover, Great Depression happened under Herbert Hoover. FDR comes in, he fixes the New Deal. Basically, conservatives are out of the picture until they begin kind of emerging from the shadows around the founding of William F. Buckley Jr.'s National Review in 1955. And then we get Reagan about 25 years later. That is a very, I think, simplistic story. There was resistance to FDR. And the New Deal essentially stopped in 1937. It stopped because FDR's court packing plan was rejected, even if the Supreme Court began to become much more accommodating to the New Deal. And it was stopped because the recession really cut into FDR's ability to expand government. And the forces, mainly Southern Democrats, but there were also conservative Republicans who were beginning to ally with those Southern Democrats. The forces opposed to FDR's expansions of government began to get the upper hand. And so I think that when conservatives came out of World War II, they said, look, we need to identify ourselves as opponents of FDR's domestic policy, but we also need to recognize the change in the geopolitical picture after World War II. And whereas we were opposed to American entry into the Second World War, we now have to take a much more aggressive approach to the communists and to the Soviet Union than FDR ever did.
One of the things that's always puzzled me about conservatism is it's the way that it sort of lost its hold on the elite. So if you go back to sort of pre-war conservatism, there were a lot of blue blood WASP upper class people that you would consider on the right. You know, the America First movement started at Yale. It was kind of a student movement at Yale, I believe, initially. Again, you think about somebody like Henry Cabot Lodge or Robert Taft, who's a major figure in your book, was definitely son of a president, as blue-blooded as they came. But essentially, Taft represented essentially the end of that lineage. And with limited exceptions like the Pews and maybe some of the DuPonts, it doesn't seem like the sort of incumbent elites of the country ever sort of took to conservatism. Lots of commentators, including George Nash himself, Kevin Phillips, Michael Lind, all noted like how demographically outside of the mainstream some of the core figures of mainstream conservative were. There's a famous cover of Nash's book, had 25 people on it on the dust jacket, and people are like, almost all these people are Catholic or they're European. There aren't very many WASPs in this movement. And I think to this day, conservatism has very heavily had to lean on populism because it's had a much narrower elite and hasn't really captured as broad a segment of the elite. How did conservatism, which you would think typically like the definition of conservatism would be a defense of sort of incumbent elites and incumbent orders, how did American conservatism sort of lose its hold on the elite? And do you see that as a problem?
Sure. Well, we have to think about different elites. So I think if you talk about business people, there are and always have been many business people who are, elite because of their stature in the economy and often in social life, who are conservative and who do share the view of the founding that I laid out. When we say elite, we're often just talking about cultural elites. And there the turn is very interesting. I mean, it is connected in many ways to the New Deal and to the growth of government. I mean, it was clear by the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, with the rise of the progressive movement in America, that there was a challenge to kind of the more traditional American view from the elite, that we have to have good standards and we have to, continue to promote the tradition coming out of usually Boston was where the source of a lot of our cultural ideas were. And then it began to shift as the American intelligentsia began to shift and have a much more modernist approach, much more critical of tradition, much more rationalistic in what they thought could be achieved, especially through government planning. And that shift in our cultural political elite, I think, was magnified by the New Deal revolution, so that now these figures had government posts, but also they used government largesse to reward themselves. And something similar to what happened in the universities. The first real conservative bestseller of the 20th century was William F. Buckley Jr.'s God and Man at Yale, which began in 1951 to surface a critique of the university system. At that time, Buckley was saying that these progressive intellectuals were beginning to select for people who thought like them within the tenure track. We're beginning to promote the books of figures who believed in central economic planning, who were critical of the Constitution. So he's identifying in 1951. And then, unfortunately, the decades since, this kind of cultural elite has only become more entrenched and more left-wing. And so conservatives have always had to kind of go outside the major cultural institutions because they've been frozen out of them. So they need to find popular support, and much is often the case that they see that everyday Americans agree with conservatives, and when they are alerted to what this cultural elite thinks, they're disgusted.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say you're a critic of populism, and much of what populism does.
A friendly critic, I would like to say, if a critic at all. Yeah. But yes, yeah.
Well, I mean, populism of sort of a left and right variety basically goes back to the dawn of America. It's a long-standing, kind of authentic part of our national culture and politics. How do you think about populism?
I think about it a lot. And I wouldn't say that I'm a critic of it. I agree with you. I think it's actually built into our structure of government. It's the very fact of our constitutional structure that creates space where you can have these kind of populist upswells. And then the additional genius of our Constitution is there's a forcing mechanism that makes these populist upswells to be channeled toward our parties, which are not in the Constitution, but we kind of select for them in the Constitution, and thus become more mainstream, become more palatable as a result, if they want to have any viability. So I think there's great upsides and downsides to populism. What are the upsides? Well, I do think that populists can more readily identify the issues and the flaws in public policy than the people in charge of public policy. And I think just in our current moment, I'll mention two examples. The first time many people heard in Washington that there was this opioid crisis ravaging America were when Republican candidates began going out on the trail in 2015. Because in the bubble where I live, in the Beltway and its surrounding counties, our wealth and our status insulate us from a lot of problems that face Americans outside of the bubble. So populism seized on the deaths of despair, rightly, in my view, and communicated that to the elite. I would also say foreign policy is another example. In Washington, we do talk about foreign policy in very abstract ways, but it's the frontline soldiers who have the skin in the game and their families. And so I do think that there is a disconnect during the Iraq War, in particular, when the Iraq War turned really bad after the mosque bombing in 2006. And then, of course, the surge, which I am a supporter of, the surge in Iraq, but it also was very costly. I do think there was a disconnect between what was affecting our soldiers and their families and then what the politicians were saying in DC and what their experts were telling them. And then finally, immigration. I think immigration is the issue of the 21st century. And in DC, no one wanted to talk about it. And in fact, the imperatives in Washington in the 21st century were always for more immigration and more regularization of illegal immigrants. And I noticed beginning in 2005, when George W. Bush attempted an amnesty bill, that this was not going to fly. Why? Because the House of Representatives, which is the body that's closest to the people, right? Elected every 2 years, smallest districts, the House of Representatives was never going to permit George W. to amnesty illegal immigrants. So populism identifies the problems. It is a very effective check on elites, and I value it for that. I do think it also has downsides. And I do think that when you look at populist movements over time, I describe several of them in my book, what you find is that while populists are very good at diagnosing problems, identifying problems, they sometimes don't really know what the solution is other than to kick the bums out. And then there's also, I do think in many populist movements, there is a tendency toward conspiracy theories. And I'm very leery of conspiracy theories. I don't think they do any good for anybody.
Oh, yeah, but definitely. We're awash in conspiracy theories today, for certain. Yeah, I always personally viewed populism as the equivalent is, it's the analogy to the oil light on your dashboard. When the oil light comes on, you got a problem.
Right.
And you better fix that problem or you're going to have a lot bigger problem.
I totally agree.
And it strikes me, one of the things that I got interested in myself was early 90s populist literature, because it certainly seemed to me that early 90s populism is practically identical to the 2016 Trump populism. I mean, similar issues, similar, phrases. And you go back and read these books, it is identical in almost all the contours. And so if you think about that era, of Pat Buchanan and Ross Perot and the paleo-conservative, neoconservative war, it seems like the conservative movement took the view that this sort of populism just needed to be totally suppressed. And they were successful at essentially suppressing it, quarantining it, eventually pushing all of those people out. They said that error light that's come on is nothing. And then 2016, Trump comes back, like this zombie from the dead, and like devours them. Essentially, did conservatism make a mistake by suppressing, or rather than somehow addressing or co-opting early 90s populism?
Well, I'm not so sure conservatives suppressed populism. So the way I'd put it is, 1992 was a major inflection point for the right. Okay. Because Bush, HW now, the dad, he had kind of fallen into his role as Reagan's successor. And I say this, admiring George H.W. Bush, the man, incredibly. But here's what I mean. In 1980, H.W. ran against Reagan in the primary.
Voodoo economics.
In fact, the Bush aide who coined the term just recently passed. Yes, he ran as a critic of Reagan and Reagan populism, which in my view is the most successful form of conservative populism of the last 100 years. Okay, so nonetheless, Reagan selected Bush for somewhat good reasons to be his vice president, and he had 8 years as president. It's the first time since the 19th century that a two-term president passed off the White House to the vice president of his own party in 1988.
Yeah, I didn't know that. I didn't learn that till I read your book. That's kind of crazy to think about.
20th century, American politics is always kind of wild and turbulent. And so what's remarkable about Reagan was he was so successful that you had 12 years of Republican governance in the White House. However, Bush getting that nomination prevented, I think, a real discussion among conservatives and within the Republican Party about what direction to take. And so I mentioned in the book that in 1988, you had the chance of Pat Buchanan running for president. Pat Buchanan still always a Cold Warrior, still very hawkish vis-a-vis the Soviet Union in 1988, but also beginning to address these new questions of economic nationalism and also social conservatism, what it meant to be a social conservative in the late 1980s. Pat on the one hand, and then Jack Kemp, who was, Reagan's Reagan in many ways, optimistic. Tax cuts will solve all our problems. Opportunity zones in the inner cities will make things right. You had the possibility of a Buchanan-Kemp contest in 1988, which would have shown, well, which face of conservatism do we want to adopt? Instead, you got HW. And HW was a disappointment to the right and ultimately to the voters. And so Bush's failures bring on this kind of post-Cold War moment where you're having that debate about populism. Buchanan comes in again, challenges Bush for the nomination in 92. Buchanan doesn't get the nomination, but he really does kind of hit his mark, and he gives a very controversial, I think pretty good speech when you look back at it at the Republican convention that year.
The culture war speech.
That's the culture war speech. And then you had Perot come in and also, again, represent kind of middle America and say, Bush, Clinton, you're ignoring the problems and challenges. So the fallout of that wasn't just Clinton's election, but I do think it was also the Republican Revolution of 1994. We often forget about it now, but this is a big deal. 1994 midterm elections, the first time in 40 years, Republicans captured the House of Representatives in full control of Congress. And they were led by a populist, Newt Gingrich. And so I don't think it's quite fair to say that populism was suppressed during this period. I do think what happened was that there was a series of debates on foreign policy in particular, on support for Israel in particular, where Buchanan's views were considered outside mainstream conservatism. And Buchanan, it should be remembered, removed himself from the Republican Party in 2000 when he went to run for the reform nomination against one Donald Trump.
Yeah. I mean, I say suppressed in the sense that the debates are over immigration and trade, predominantly. And like, not only did we not take that into account, we actually pushed the pedal to the metal. I mean, post 1992, we had so many trade deals. Not only did NAFTA finish getting it put through, we had the Uruguay round of trade talks, permanent normal trade relations with China, immigration just soared, basically. And then with the Iraq War, the Unpatriotic Conservatives, essay by David Fromm, it does seem that like even any sort of military skepticism was essentially anathema. Bush certainly did not embody any of those populist values.
No, but I think there's a difference between losing a debate and being suppressed, right? And I think those views you're talking about, they lost the debate. They were being expressed elsewhere. I mean, the classic example here is Buchanan's magazine, the American Conservative, founded in 2002. The From essay you mentioned, Unpatriotic Conservatives, comes out 6 months later. Clearly, the polls are there. At the time, it seemed like the From version of conservatism and the Republican Party was ascendant. With the view of history, we see that was not really the case. Mm-hmm. So I just think I would use it as, I would say, just a different term of art. I would just say that the debates were happening, and what we saw in the 1990s, especially from the Republican Party, right, which is not the same as the conservative movement, we saw from the Republican Party was a move toward adopting Bush's view on immigration, Bush's view on trade, and then after 9/11, right? Because remember, Bush comes into office in 2001 saying that he would have a humble foreign policy and that he would not nation build. But again, the contingency of history and the demands of the American public after 9/11 gave us the Bush doctrine, gave us the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So one lesson again of the book is that these different factions kind of wax and wane over time. And right now, you can say that had that debate happened between Buchanan and Kemp in '88, Buchanan probably lost. But right now, in 2025, Buchanan won.
Yeah. Well, your book ends, again, as you say, Biden's inauguration in 2021. We had the Trump era. Trump lost in 2020. I realize that's a controversial statement to say in some quarters, but he lost. And it's not totally clear what's going to happen with Trumpism. You kind of know it's not like he's showing any signs of going away.
No.
But the future is sort of out. And now here we are, 4 years later. Trump won the popular vote. Institutional society is basically at least playing like he's legitimate in a way that they were not back in 2016. For the sort of anti-Trump perspective in kind of conservatism, the Republican Party, it's sort of a low point, I guess you'd say. Absolutely. Right now. How do you assess like the way that things have played out since the book?
They did not go as I thought. I thought that Trump's loss in 2020 and the events around January 6th would mean that he would not be a force in American politics. And then I thought, after the 22 midterm elections, which were very disappointing for the Republicans, Trump was even weaker because Trump had been behind the selection of many of the Senate and gubernatorial candidates who failed to win office in 2022. And then the comeback began. Almost as soon as I sent that afterword for my paperback to the publisher, the comeback began. And the comeback, I think, has a few dimensions. The major one is the lawfare. Absolutely, the lawfare. The FBI raid on Mar-a-Lago, and then the appointment of the special prosecutor after Trump declared his candidacy for president in 2024. And then the following spring, the Alvin Bragg indictment in New York rallied the Republican base around Donald Trump in an amazing fashion. So that's number one. And I think that helped Donald Trump immensely. Number two was Biden. Biden had an opportunity after 2022 to say, I am old. I'm going to leave the stage and now preside over a Democratic primary of a rising generation. He didn't do that. Not only did he not do that, he doubled down on his policies, which, I'm a known critic of Biden. I think they've been terrible. And I think the American people share this view. You see from the Gallup organization just the week that you and I are recording this, most Americans say that Biden's presidency will be viewed negatively by history. So not only was Trump now in a unique position as a victim of a two-tiered system of justice, he could point and say, Biden's policies have made you poor. They have made you less safe, right? They have opened the border, creating all these secondary consequences affecting our cities, our communities, our schools, our housing market. Think about what life was like with me prior to COVID, right? And voters preferred life under Trump. Mm-hmm. And so I think it was those two things. It was the lawfare and then Biden. And that gave us this most remarkable political comeback. And what it has meant now is that Biden is the exception, not Trump. We're still in the Trump era, right? The Trump era began in 2015. We're still in it a decade later, and it's going to last. It could last more than a decade. So that I think is something that I did not quite recognize when I was writing my book. Now, this is why I should just say by closing, this is why historians don't like to write about the present, because we really don't know how things are going to turn out. We want to be there to see it, but if you write at any one given moment, we don't know what the future holds. When I'm writing about the 1920s, or I'm writing about the 1950s or 60s or 70s or now 80s, well, okay, you can wrap your arms around this. You have time to kind of let it marinate. You do see the after effects generations down the line, right? So it is a risk of writing history that goes up to the present that sometimes you don't really foresee the ultimate consequences of individual acts and of government policies.
Yeah, well, we'll see what the future holds. It's going to be topsy-turvy, to be sure. Thank you so much for joining me. I could have spent like a 3-hour Rogan interview just asking you about, there really are questions in every chapter. I didn't get to it all. So I selfishly ask you things that I'm interested in,
Well,
just because I wanted to see. And as we sort of highlighted here, Matthew Continetti's book, The Right, which I have here holding up to the screen, is a different spin than the same old three-legged stool stuff that you can get from some of the other sources. So even if you've read other histories, this is definitely one that gives you a different perspective, and again, a lot of different details that you may not get anywhere else. So Matt, thank you so much for joining me. I greatly appreciate it.
oh, thank you, Aaron. I've had a lot of fun talking with you.